Welcome to the Polygamer podcast, where gaming is for everyone. Join us as we expand the boundaries of the gaming community.
Hi, it's Ken Gagnon with the Polygamer podcast, episode number 53 for Wednesday, October 12th, 2016. And joining me today is Mr. Ian Danskin of Innuendo Studios. Hi, Ian.
Hi, Ken.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. And yourself?
I'm not bad. Now let's get some potential conflicts of interest out of the way right off the bat. First off, I am one of your minor Patreon backers.
Minor Patreon backers?
Very, yes. I'm sorry I can't be giving more.
Oh, that's okay. I appreciate it, every little bit.
Well, that's what I figure. Little bits add up, so it's on everybody else's shoulders to make it significant. The other thing is that we both live in Boston, but I don't think we've ever actually crossed paths before, have we?
We met at Game Loop a couple years ago.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. That must have been 2014 then.
Something like that, yeah.
I think that was my first Game Loop.
It was mine too.
It must have also been around that time that you made your YouTube debut. You did a video about Phil Fish, the developer of Fez, one of the 3 indie games featured in Indie Game the Movie. Was your video around the same time as Game Loop?
I think it was. It was around then. There was an after Game Loop. For anyone who doesn't know, Game Loop is this gaming unconference we do here in Boston. And there was like a dinner afterwards, and all these folks were like hanging out at the pub. And there was sort of this pause where people asked what I did, and was like, oh, well, I guess I did this video you may have heard of. And they're like, oh, what? And I said, this is Phil Fish. And like 5 heads just shot at me at once. And I was like, oh God.
You outed yourself.
Yeah. And everyone's like, wait. Yeah, the voice. I recognize it now.
That's amazing. Yeah, so let's see. Game Loop was August 9th, and your Phil Fish video came out June 16th, so you were less than 2 months into your fame at that point.
Yeah, I think my fame was over at that point.
No, I would say it was just beginning.
Oh, thank you.
So for those who have not seen that video, let's start even more broadly than that. What is Innuendo Studios?
Well, that's a broad question. Innuendo Studios, functionally speaking, is the name of my YouTube channel. It's also kind of my freelancing doing business as name. So I actually, sometimes people have to actually write Innuendo Studios on paychecks when they send them to me. But for the most part, it's just kind of me doing my thing. As so far as YouTube goes, I do a video essay series on YouTube, which I guess is called Innuendo Studios. Haven't put a lot of thought into the branding. But my channel is called Innuendo Studios, and I do video essays about games and social politics and web culture, I would say.
Now that video, the original one about Phil Fish, that was originally part of your education, correct?
Kind of, sort of. Like, I'm a part-time student at Massachusetts College of Art and Design. And I'm in a very, very open-ended major that just kind of lets you make whatever you want and bring it in. So I had been wanting to get into video for a while, and I kind of told myself, okay, I'm going to present this video on this day as like a motivator, but I could have presented anything on that day and I still would have gotten credit for it. So like it wasn't satisfying any particular assignment. It was sort of a self-imposed assignment. And you never expected that video to get as popular as it did. So did you have plans for more videos, or was it that original success that you decided to capitalize on? Well, if I'd wanted to capitalize on the success, I probably would have gone about it pretty differently. It was about 9 months until I released another proper video essay. Yeah, I had a whole list of topics that I wanted to talk about, and I kind of went with Phil Fish first just because it felt like the ideas had gestated long enough that I felt like I knew what I wanted to say and I knew how I wanted to say it. I had been intending to talk about Anita Sarkeesian for a while. I had been intending to talk a lot about adventure games for a while. I still kind of have a big list of topics that I came into this intending to talk about. And you work through those ideas at about the rate of 1 a month nowadays? A little bit less than 1 a month, but 1 a month is what I'm always shooting for. So I want to talk primarily about the Why Are You So Angry series you did that starts off with the short history of Anita Sarkeesian. But before we get to that, let's talk about some other fun stuff. Like, you apparently have this obsession with adventure games. Is that correct? Yes, I am an adventure game enthusiast. And does that stem from your childhood or what? I mean, probably. I think the first computer game my dad ever bought me was The Secret of Monkey Island. Like, we had some other games in the house, but the first time I ever went to a store and said, I want this, and then it actually came home with me, that was The Secret of Monkey Island. And I don't know, maybe it's that had a big impression on me at the time, but you know, my parents wouldn't let me play games like Doom, and that was something that, you know, when I was older, I finally came around to, but they were okay with me playing adventure games. So yeah, that was a big part. Like I was such a LucasArts fanboy in my childhood. And then you sort of end up in that like starvation economy of adventure games kind of stopped coming out by the time I left high school. Like they hadn't stopped coming out, but adventure games of the scope and ambition that I was used to had stopped coming out. And so it just becomes this thing you get very fixated on. Like, oh, I hope another good one comes out someday. And now they are again. And it's just, it delights me. It makes me very happy.
But these aren't the same games we played in our childhood. There'll probably never be another Monkey Island. Are they really as good as we remember?
I think some of them are. I did a replay a while ago of a lot of like the LucasArts and Sierra classics, and I will admit that a lot of them are not as good as we remember them. But there are some gems from that era that I think are actually some of the most amazing games I've ever played.
What is it that makes them so amazing?
I think interactive storytelling is just a really, really fascinating form. Like storytelling, one of the reasons I do video essays is because I like taking all of this data and finding the way to present it that makes it a compelling story. And a lot of the work that I do in other parts of my life usually come back to storytelling. Like I've been bitten by the storytelling bug. And the idea of actually being embedded within a narrative is a really, really fascinating and compelling experience that I think that we are still kind of figuring out. But I think we do really, really interesting things when we tell stories in that way. I mean, I did a 4-part series on why I think interactive narrative is so fascinating earlier this year called Story Beats. And I think adventure games being kind of the only genre that is pretty much devoted to that and not really anything else, it's just the purest distillation of one of the most fascinating things to me in games.
And nowadays we have new adventure games, not only stuff like Thimbleweed Park, which is coming out, and Cathy Rain, which just came out, but also really creative interpretations of the genre, like Life is Strange or The Walking Dead. Are those games, are they effectively capturing what made adventure games so successful 30 years ago?
Some are, some aren't. Like I recently played Dropsy, which was made by Jay Tholen. It was just kind of like this one man and a programmer and I think maybe a couple contractors making a game that they paid for with Kickstarter. And that one is super, super classic pixel arty adventure game. Like that, if it wasn't such a weird subject, it probably could have come out in like 1995. But I think a lot of the games that are blowing up now, like Walking Dead and Life is Strange, those games are much more like a natural progression of the adventure game. Like you can see a lot of 90s adventure game influence in them, but there's also, they are pulling from a lot of other genres as well. Like modern adventure games that are really like sort of on the cutting edge, trying new things. They take a lot from the Shock series and they take a lot from like Heavy Rain. They're really pulling from a lot of different influences. And I think that's actually making adventure games a lot more interesting and experimental. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it works enough of the time that I'm excited about the developments.
The genre really is evolving. They're trying different things, and the parts that succeed are what evolve into the next generation of adventure games.
Which basically was not happening for like a decade and a half. Like the only people making adventure games were really closely sticking to the classic mold because pretty much they were selling to a niche audience. And now that the public in general seems to be interested in them again, you can actually start experimenting and trying new things. And then other people are picking up what you tried and trying something else with that new idea. And that's just really exciting to me.
Yeah, I've really been enjoying them myself. I grew up with stuff like Space Quest and Leisure Suit Larry. And
Oh, you were a Sierra kid.
I was.
We have to fight now.
Do we? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I grew up on the Apple II. There weren't a lot of LucasArts games on there.
Okay.
We had Maniac Mansion, but most of the rest of it was King's Quest and the like. Were they really that different philosophically, Sierra and Lucas?
In ways, yeah. LucasArts sort of pioneered the idea of not punishing you for exploration.
Granted.
Where Sierra was all about that. And I could eat up your entire podcast talking about the differences between LucasArts and Sierra. Like Sierra was much more about putting you in one map and slowly expanding how much of it is relevant, where LucasArts was much more about you are in this location and then you are in this completely different location and then this completely different location. It was much more quest-based, and Sierra tended to be much more hub-based.
Interesting. I was not aware of that distinction.
It's just something I noticed when I started replaying them. I mean, it's not a universal rule, but I found it was more common with one than with the other.
Well, I found in your videos that you tend to have quite the eye for detail, and you draw correlations that a superficial playthrough of a game or even a genre might not have revealed. You're really thinking about this stuff critically.
Well, overthinking everything is kind of this channel's brand at this point.
Seems to be working for you.
Yeah.
Excellent. And when you're not doing these YouTube videos, you are, as you said, a part-time student, a freelance animator, a freelance podcast editor, doing a lot of different things, right?
Yeah, I call myself a professional undergrad. I've been trying to get my bachelor's degree for most of my adult life at this point, but soon. And then, yeah, I freelance. I do a lot of video editing these days. I've worked in animation, and I do podcasting still, but it doesn't pay as well as the video, so I'm not doing as much of it.
I have found podcasts harder to monetize than videos.
Yeah. And, most people, it is cheaper to just learn how to use Audacity than it is to hire someone to do it for you.
Yeah, and Audacity is certainly much easier to learn than Adobe Premiere Pro.
Yes.
So let's see. So you've been gaming for longer than you've been an undergrad. You've been playing adventure games since you were a kid. And in one of your videos, you said, this was from the Why So Angry series, I am not an expert. I am not an authority. I'm just a guy who used to be 15 and angry and figuring himself out online. What were you angry about? I mean, granted, most 15-year-olds are angry about something. What were you angry about?
I think it was, I could be angry about just about anything in those days, When you're 15, I think the thing you are most angry about is that you feel powerless, right? Like, we can get into the psychology of it where, like, they talk about how when you're very young, you go through this phase called dependence, right? Like, you are a kid, you can't take care of yourself, you're barely even your own individual, and your parents take care of you, and they just kind of make all your decisions for you. And then there is a phase you get to where you actually are kind of able to assert yourself, and then that phase is independence, right? Like, that's typically where your teen rebellion happens. You're pushing back against all the power sources in your life, like teachers and authority figures that have been making these decisions on your behalf, and you're trying to assert yourself. But you're not necessarily able to make all the decisions for yourself. You just kind of know that you're able to make some, and it's very, very important to you assert yourself. And then, provided you grow up as an emotionally well-rounded person, as an adult, you hit the phase that we call interdependence, which is, yes, you are dependent on other people, but those are dependencies that you opt into decisively and by mutual agreement. And when I went through my independence phase, I was a 15-year-old nerd in high school. I didn't have a lot of friends, and the friends I had weren't very popular. And so aside from the fact that I'd been picked on most of my life, I was just very frustrated about all the power I didn't have. And I think when you're young and you're on the internet, you go out looking for places where you can feel powerful. You go looking for forums where people don't know your history, they don't know your background, and you can kind of rise to the ranks of being one of the cool people within that group that you really can't be in your own life if you were not lucky enough to be one of the big tough kids who gets to talk crap to all the other kids. And so, yeah, I was angry about a lot of petty little things in those days, and I found spaces in which I could vent that anger. And honestly, I could be kind of terrible to people who seemed less powerful than me. I was so used to not being the person who had power that I abused power in the few places where I had it.
I don't know how different our ages are, but when I was a kid, I found that power in online services like CompuServe because the World Wide Web wasn't really a thing quite yet. Where were you?
I actually, let's see, there were a few different forums I went to. There was actually a LucasArts fan forum that I stayed on for years. And after a year or two, we had pretty much stopped talking about LucasArts or adventure games as our sole subject, and we pretty much talked about whatever. And we weren't really coming back there for games. We would talk about games, but we were there for the community. And I feel like if I could go find the archives of that forum there, you could basically see me going from an angry teenager when I joined to being kind of a decently rounded person by the time the forum sort of went away. And that was I was really lucky that there were some cool people there. But I am not proud of the way I acted on the forum in the first year or two I was there. I asserted myself as one of the cooler people there, and I talked a lot of shit about the other people there. And there were other people who rose to the ranks of being the cool ones, and at least one of them was basically like a troll, like was just straight up a troll today, that if I were a moderator of a forum, I would probably have kicked him off. But he stuck around and was just a member of the community and was just judgy and rude and critical of everybody. And he was one of the people that I cozied up with. And if he set the tone, then I followed that tone. And I was very dismissive of any belief that I felt I could scoff at. There was some anti-feminism on that forum. I was pretty lucky in that there were also a lot of very smart people I respected challenging that when it reared its head. So in the grand scheme, that actually became a very educational experience for me. But there was a lot of petty teenage anger on that forum. And I really wonder what would happen if there hadn't been more, to my mind, enlightened people to challenge it at the time.
You said in one of your videos that there seemed to be a lot of angry 15-year-olds or people who are acting like it, people who aren't growing out of that phase and still displaying that behavior on the internet. Would you say it was those enlightened people who helped make you the person you are today and not be so angry?
I think so. I mean, it's a lot of people, right? Like, it takes a village. And I think Zoe Quinn actually gave a talk about this at GDC several years ago, like at the Indie Soapbox session, where she just talked about how she interviewed a bunch of different people who say that they used to do this kind of like trollish, harassing behavior on the internet and grew out of it, and asked them to share what made you grow out of it. And in pretty much every case, it was never one individual thing, but a number of small experiences. So it would be seeing someone like, I remember, this is a weirdly specific memory I have, but there was someone posted an article about Orson Scott Card, and like all of us on the forum just absolutely adored Ender's Game. And someone posted this interview with Orson Scott Card that was like basically saying, you know, he openly admitted what a raging homophobe he was. And the person interviewing him was apparently a lesbian, and she was like taking it really, really badly as she was writing about it. And one of the people on the forum just said, like, you can't take seriously anything they write on salon.com. And that's a really blatantly biased thing. Like, why would you even take that seriously? And I am really glad that there were people there who said, look, whether or not this is an article with a slant to it, he did do and say these specific things. And those things are pretty blatantly homophobic. And yes, you can try to separate the art from the artist, but it is still clear that a lot of people who identified with this book are realizing that maybe they did not see themselves as much as they wanted to, and maybe they wanted to see something that isn't actually there in it. Because how could a person this bigoted and close-minded write a book that touched us so much? And a lot of us were really disillusioned by that. And I don't know, like just seeing that argument that like you don't need to take this, you know, pro-queer argument seriously because of the site that it's on or because of the tone it's written in. But that got challenged. And that's not like in and of itself the thing that changes your mind. You know, I had a lot of female friends, and so I got a certain exposure to like what it was like to get creeped on by dudes. And I had fairly progressive parents. I think at this point I'm a lot more progressive than they are, but for the time, they were very progressive, especially given the families they came from. They came from much more conservative Midwestern stock. And I think it's all these little things, you know, like conversations that you have here and there, places that people take you to conversationally. Like it's just bit by bit.
You did a breakdown of some of that anger that other people exhibit in your series, Why So Angry? And that was a big departure from the young man that you just described yourself being. You grew up to be a more enlightened individual who was a little bit calmer and more in control of themselves and their emotions. But not everybody necessarily takes the next step of being an outspoken advocate for feminism or being an active feminist. I have plenty of friends who are decent people who they're not necessarily outspoken about those values, or they don't even identify as a feminist. So you, on the other hand, in July of 2015, did a 6-part, 68-minute video series called Why Are You So Angry?, where you broke down all the behaviors and attitudes and demographics of people who are so angry about video games and so defensive and so scared that people like Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn are coming to take away their violent, bloody shooters. What swung you almost not necessarily from an extreme, but from being an angry young man to the opposite extreme?
I feel like it is very hard for me to talk myself out of things if I'm convinced by them. And I've gone through this phase many times in my life where like I'll be presented with some, I would say, ethical argument, and it sort of sits with me for a while. And accepting this particular ethical argument would require me to change something about my life, right? The video series, Why Are You So Angry? I talk about the experience of vegetarians, the experience of atheists, the experience of environmentalists. And I'm actually sort of surprised that the people watching the series never really twigged to the fact that I am all three of those things. And none of those are necessarily things that like I wanted to be, right? Like when I thought about like, well, gee, you know, like, should I care a lot about environmentalism? It's like, well, I mean, there's a lot of decisions that have to change about my life if I did. And there's a lot of things, there's a lot of ways in which my life would be harder and more inconvenient if I really committed myself to having a lower carbon footprint. And you generally like start going through what are all the reasons I could maybe not do this. But I feel like I just kind of can't talk myself into not doing something if I think that something actually makes sense, like if it actually holds up to scrutiny. And I recognize the patterns people go through when they're like trying to convince themselves that they don't need to care about this thing, that they don't need to take this thing seriously. And I just can't do it. Like there comes a time where I've been chewing on this thing and going through every rationalization I can think of, where eventually the rationalization just doesn't hold up. Like I don't pick that rationalization and then just drop the subject and stay away from it. I tend to keep grinding on it in the back of my head. And if I cannot justify not being a feminist, then I'll be a feminist or feminist ally, however we want to call it. And that's really what it comes down to. Like I believe in feminism because I really can't convince myself not to. Once I'm a person who is in the public eye making videos, if there's a thing that I care about, if I feel like I have a perspective on something that I'm frustrated that I don't hear, I similarly can't really justify not saying it myself. And I felt like I had spent so much time thinking about like, why do people react this way? Why do I hear the same type of argument from people who are like yelling at me for being a vegetarian and the people yelling at me for believing in feminism? And I start recognizing these things and making these connections. And, you know, you follow a lot of people who are getting attacked by GamerGate when GamerGate is happening. And you're reading these posts that they're making and these articles that they're spreading around. And you end up with a whole lot of information and a fairly complicated opinion on the subject and start to feel like, why wouldn't I make a video about this if I'm going to make a video about, you know, why I love adventure games, or a video about why I think Call of Duty is a really weird series? It becomes a point where you're not actually just neutral on a subject. You're not actually just dispassionate about something. You are actively choosing not to talk about it. And I cannot defend choosing not to talk about something that's on my mind. So yeah, it's just sort of a weird commitment to like integrity of ethics. If I believe something, I feel like I cannot convince myself not to live by it.
So your videos aren't just things that interest you or hobbies that you enjoy. They are your values expressed.
They can be, yeah.
And you draw, as I said, a lot of very interesting correlations about how people behave and why they behave the way they do. But as you mentioned, you are a lifelong undergrad student, not someone with, say, a PhD in psychology. How do you come to these conclusions?
I don't know if there's a secret to it. Like you pay attention to people. You think a lot about it. I'm sure there's all kinds of psychological things I would be completely out to sea with, but there are certain things where I feel like I get it. And I'm sure I owe a lot to various different readings that I've done. Like I've read psychological papers. I cited a few of them in the video series itself. Like there was this one that the one about geekdom as a simulated oppressed ethnicity. And like that was a really fascinating article, and it was pretty in depth and pretty heavily research based. And when I take an interest in things like this, I tend to go out of my way to read these things. But yeah, I don't have any formal study in psychology. I don't have any formal study in sociology. I'm kind of self-taught to the degree that I talk about these things.
Obviously, you consult various sources and you have a bibliography. Do you conduct any original research, like interviewing the people you're doing stories about? I presume Phil Fish didn't know your video about him was coming.
No. No, I don't often conduct interviews per se. Like, I have a pretty great community of people in my life who are from a lot of different walks of life that, I have a lot of conversations with in general. And sometimes I'll sort of run by some stuff I'm thinking about and give them opportunities to challenge it or whatever. But it's not like I was dialing up Catherine Cross or anything and being like, hey, you're getting attacked by GamerGate right now. Like, can you tell me how that feels? Like, you know that website, The Womansplainer, that Elizabeth Simmons made?
Yes.
Yeah. So, like, it's one of those things where I don't necessarily want to interview people to have them share their experience with me if it is experience that I could go and research, because I don't really want to ask people who are being harassed to do the emotional labor of describing their harassment to me, especially unpaid, because I don't really have a budget to pay people to do that. When almost across the board, like, anything they could tell me, either they or someone going through the same thing has been documenting, like, incredibly thoroughly every which way. But I did know some people who were either being harassed by GamerGate or had been harassed by angry people at some point in their lives who were able to just talk to me in general, like in casual conversation. I end up exposed to a lot of this information even when I don't go out looking for it.
And you get responses from your videos, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. For example, you know that Phil Fish saw your video, I believe.
I have it on authority that he did. Complete serendipity, but Phil Fish ended up in the news for completely unrelated reasons the day after I posted the video, and came back to Twitter after having, canceled his account and seemingly salted and burned the earth. But he showed back up to share his opinions on YouTube. And someone told me, I didn't see this, but someone told me that right before deleting his account again, the last tweet he made was, "This is Phil Fish." But that tweet disappeared because he shut the account down. So I have heard that he said that, which would imply that he saw it. Also, given how big that video was, I'm pretty sure he at least knew about it. But I don't know, and I don't know how he felt about it. I feel a little weird about it.
Now, that video was a study in internet fame. There will be a link to it in the show notes, but for those who haven't seen it, can you broadly say whether or not it portrayed Phil Fish in a positive light?
Whether or not it portrayed Phil in a positive light seems to depend on what your opinion of Phil was before you saw it. When I showed it to my class, which was mostly people who did not have any idea who Phil Fish was before they saw it, they thought that it was pretty critical of him. And a lot of them said, like, I really appreciated that, you stayed pretty nonpartisan in making this video. But my personal opinion, having watched it, is that I think he might be kind of an asshole. And I was like, I mean, whatever your opinion is. But people who already knew a lot of these things about Phil and people who had formulated an opinion on him, to them, the fact that I was deconstructing a lot of the dominant narratives about Phil made it seem much more like I was defending him. It's really fascinating to me. Like, pretty much every comment from someone who says, I have no idea who Phil was, thought that it was pretty critical. And pretty much everyone who did know who Phil was and either loved or hated him thought that it was a defense. And I felt kind of weird and conflicted about that, because my goal was to say that, like, you know what, having an opinion on Phil Fish is not really something anyone is obligated to do. And kind of the subtextual thesis of the video is Phil Fish doesn't matter to the degree that we think he matters. So why do we think he matters so much? And the fact that anyone's response to that would be, well, let me tell you why Phil Fish matters, is like, whoa, okay, we can have that argument, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't know. I would say that I was talking about the need to have an opinion at all and kind of trying to keep my opinion to myself. But I don't know if I succeeded in that.
A lot of your videos are about specific games like Monkey Island, or specific characters like Sonic the Hedgehog, or cultural social movements like GamerGate. This video used Phil Fish as a case study for yet another phenomenon. How does it feel to be doing a video about a specific person, knowing that they might see it?
Well, when I made it, I kind of figured no one would see it, right? Like, nobody's first video goes viral. Like, I figured, okay, I'm going to make this video and it's going to build up views with time, and it's going to take me a year or so to develop an audience, and I have no idea how big I'll ever get. And then it exploded, and that was a very bizarre experience. I kind of came to it thinking of Phil Fish as a public figure, that like whatever, public figures are used to things being written about them, and that it probably wouldn't be any sweat off his back. And then having it blow up the way it did made me really self-conscious about what effect it might have on him if he saw it, because suddenly the odds of him seeing it were much, much greater. I don't know. I tend to focus less on individuals now and talk more about games or movements or collections of individuals. I also got some criticism of it where people said, like, no matter how neutral you're trying to be, this is a video that is at the very least offering people the opportunity to reassess the treatment of a pretty well-off white dude at a time when gaming is absolutely crucifying all these more marginalized people. And why are we talking about Phil when we could be talking about these other things? And why are we asking people to maybe be gentler with him, which on some level you could say I was doing, when there are so many people who need that gentleness even more? And that's, again, another reason where it's like, oh, man, maybe I don't want to focus on people as much, because you can affect people's lives and you can also affect the lives of the people that you didn't talk about.
Yeah, about a year later, this was summer of 2014 that you did the Phil Fish video. Summer of 2015, a year later, you did the Why Are You So Angry series. This is now also a year after GamerGate originally broke. That was about a year and a half ago now that you did that video series. What was the reaction to that when you released it?
Again, depends on where you're standing. The reaction from feminists and progressive people on the internet was very positive. There was some criticism, but most of it was framed in very respectful and tactful ways and led to some very productive conversations. Most people generally respected a lot of the content of it and needed to not necessarily disagree, but more elaborate or complicate certain parts of it. And so that was very validating. A lot of people that I've really respected online and were kind of big inspirations for me ended up like having conversations with me or even following me on Twitter. And that was like amazing for me. And it sort of felt like, in a weird way, even though these videos, even you add them all up and they haven't got as many views collectively as the Phil Fish video, that kind of felt like hitting the big leagues in a way, that all of a sudden I can say, like, yeah, I actually sometimes have conversations with these people who used to be like up on pedestals for me. And that's pretty neat. Obviously, the kinds of angry people on the internet that I was dissecting in that video were very, very unhappy with me and hurled a lot of invective my way, which I guess was to be expected.
When I first found your video on the internet, I wasn't familiar with you personally. All I did know was that there are a lot of videos about Anita Sarkeesian on YouTube. And they very often fall into the category of not agreeing with her, to put it politely. and your first video, the subject line is, "Why Are You So Angry? Part 1, A Short History of Anita Sarkeesian." And I was very hesitant to click on it because I had no idea what I was going to get. For all I knew, you were a men's rights activist and you were contributing to the audience that was shouting her down. Did you ever consider giving it a different title, like a more, I don't know, feminist one, whatever that might be?
I guess that didn't really occur to me. Like, originally it was just going to be one video called Why Are You So Angry? And I figured that's like pretty open-ended. And then as I was writing it, I was like, oh, this is going to be pretty long. Maybe it's got to be 2 videos. And then it just kept going. And I was like, okay, maybe this needs to be like 6 videos. And so then it was just thinking of like, well, what's the title of each video? I'm like, well, the first video is focused on Anita. So I guess A Short History of Anita Sarkeesian is a good title for that part. And I don't think it ever really occurred to me like what putting those 2 titles right next to each other was going to do. In a way, I guess it sort of functions as like a Trojan horse. People go in thinking like, yeah, I'm going to see some guy take down Anita Sarkeesian. And then I kind of dissected exactly those people. And it seems like most people who would actually agree with it did end up seeing it despite the title. So I think for the most part, it worked out okay. But yeah, that was maybe a bit of a boner.
No, you make a good point, though, is that the feminists who watch those videos, to a degree, you're preaching to the audience. It's really the people that video is about who are the ones that need to be seeing it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, kind of, as I stress in the first video, it's really not for them. Like I say, like, you are welcome to watch, but I'm not here to talk to you. I'm here to talk about you. To me, I was trying to reach more the middle ground undecided folks that I probably was at some point in my life. I was trying to talk to people who knew about Gamergate and knew about Anita Sarkeesian and maybe even sided with, the angels in that, but still didn't think very critically about it and still didn't really know what to do. And mostly were kind of like dropping it like it's hot. Those were the people I really wanted to be like, you need to think really critically about why these things are happening, not just like say, hey, this is bad. I agree that this is bad, but think about why it's happening. And think about what your role is in allowing it to happen and what your role can be in trying to stem it.
As you mentioned, you got a spectrum of feedback on these videos. As far as you know, did you change anybody's mind?
I have gotten people who contacted me and said, I realized in watching this video that I have been Angry Jack. And that's really something when that message comes in. I don't know how many people had a positive experience like that and just I never found out about it. So it's really hard for me to gauge, like, are the 15 or so people who've sent me that message all the people who had that experience, or is it indicative of a larger trend? I really don't know, but that's something.
Wow, that is very encouraging to know that you actually did reach somebody.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. It's weird. Anytime somebody treats me like I'm a role model, I'm like, oh, okay, cool.
So why are you studying video animation? That is your study, isn't it?
Sort of. I mean, I'm in the everything major. So the department I'm in is called the Studio for Interrelated Media, and it's the multidisciplinary department. So you are actually required to take lots of classes in other departments of your choosing. So me specifically, I do work that is animation, video, audio, performance, all kinds of that stuff, but I can kind of avoid any discipline I'm not interested in. Like, I don't do a lot of sculpture, bladesmithery, or anything.
You're using that medium to reach people, and so that is what you're studying. You could just as easily be studying not the vehicle, but the message itself. You could be studying the social sciences, like social work or ethnography or psychology. So why study the vehicle and not the message?
Well, I mean, studying the vehicle kind of predated me having a message, Like, I went to school thinking I want to do film and video. And that was the passion. And I originally thought, like, I'm going to make narrative films. And just as I've gone along and I've elaborated a lot of the opinions I had when I was younger, and I think become a pretty complicated thinker, using my chosen medium as a vehicle to talk about that made the most sense to me, as opposed to like writing research papers or something.
Now, you knew that when you did put this message out, you wouldn't reach everybody. And as you said, you did get some negative commentary and responses, none of which was really all that surprising. You took some preventive measures, such as having somebody monitor your social media for you while the videos were coming out at the rate of like one a day or so. How did you find such a person who was willing to expose themselves to that vitriol? If you don't mind me asking, I'm obviously not going to ask you to identify that person or give any details about that person, but I just want to know who would volunteer for such a job.
I have people in my life who care very much about me, and it's often easier to look at insults that are hurled at someone else than it is to look at the ones hurled at yourself. So I have I had some people, they're credited at the end of the video, who like actually read over the scripts before I posted them, because I was like, hey, I'm going to need a woman's perspective on this. I'm going to need people who are educated in other fields from me to challenge me and to like force me to talk about certain things. And there were certain phrasings or even certain entire subjects that almost didn't make it into the videos, but people took a look at it for me. And it's people like that. It's people who care about me and want to make sure that I'm okay, who were willing to sort of stand as a buffer between me and Twitter, basically. And I'm very lucky to have those people. I'm very grateful. And if they listen to this, I hope they know how much I care about them.
And is one of the reasons you recruited these helpers for social media because it would have distracted from the time you needed to create the videos, or because of the psychological burden of having to deal with it directly yourself?
Very much the psychological burden. I mean, the summer that video came out was a very hard year for me in general. I guess we're recording this on World Mental Health Day, so I guess it might as well come out and say that, like, in that year, I was in the process of developing an anxiety disorder, and that releasing that video was a very, very inopportune time to be talking about that stuff, and giving myself, like, a little space where, like, okay, people are going to say terrible, terrible, terrible things about me, and pretty much I only need to know about it if it's actually putting me at risk. And I have a friend who actually does information security professionally. And I talked to them and they sort of like gave me all this advice on like, here's how to lock down your social media. Here's how to make sure people can't hack your stuff. So, you know, like, as I say in the video, I turned on two-factor authentication on pretty much any social media that allows for that. And I changed all my passwords to much, much stronger passwords and keep myself safe. And then, yeah, I put someone between me and the angry people. I mean, I tend not to spend too much time reading comments anyway, because, like, I feel like there's two outcomes when you read a comment, which is either somebody says something crappy and you feel bad, or someone says something really complimentary and you feel good. But most of the time, Twitter and YouTube are not places where you're going to have a very constructive conversation. So what constructive criticism happened? I usually ended up having it float my way one way or another. And I was able to like respond to some of it, even do some write-ups. Like I actually got a really, really constructive, it was a conversation with Zoe Quinn and Lindsay Ellis on Twitter where they actually deconstructed some of my advice in the last part of the series and ended up doing a write-up about it that basically says, like, it is important to engage with Angry Jack's rhetoric. It is actually sometimes dangerous to engage with Angry Jack directly, because when you argue with him, even if your privilege protects you from him going after you, he will sometimes go after, like, Anita just in retribution. Like, she is his symbol of feminism, so when he's mad at you about feminism, he's just going to go attack her. And a lot of people get harassed basically as bystanders to an argument that doesn't involve them at all. And so I sort of had to do this thing saying, like, okay, maybe, yes, in challenging Angry Jack, you don't need to engage Angry Jack himself, but try to find a way to reach his audience without including him. And that's like, that was a really, really constructive, valuable conversation. Outside of conversations like that, there's really not much reason to look at a lot of comments. Like, I know that's not what you're supposed to say on the internet today, that's like, oh, it's silencing the community. But like, even when people say really good things about me and it makes me feel really good, you can get kind of addicted to that approval, and you can start trying to do things that you think those people will like and will get them to say nicer things about you. And I don't think that's always the best motivation to be doing what you do. So I don't know. I kind of try to avoid a lot of the commentariat anyway.
I myself questioned some of the advice at the end of your last video because you did encourage to engage Jack, as you just mentioned, and that almost seems like provoking the mob. For example, if I go on Twitter and I use the hashtag GamerGate, that is not going to end well.
No.
And even if I engage a one specific person without the hashtag who seems to be displaying some GamerGate-like behavior, he can very quickly dogpile me.
Yeah. And generally speaking, like, you know, we're a couple of white dudes. They dogpile us. They tend not to go as hard for us as they go for other people. And my thinking at the time was, well, okay, like, if they go after me, probably nothing terrible is going to happen. And maybe someone will see that conversation, see that I'm making sense, and then they won't buy into this. And they will see that this argument is getting challenged. But I didn't really consider what the other ramifications might be, that they won't just get mad at me. They will get mad at everyone who symbolizes what I'm talking about. And sometimes they attack them in addition to me. So, yeah, it ended up not necessarily being the best advice. And given that like it was 6 videos culminating to that point, I felt a little sheepish about that. But really all you can do is be like, okay, well, take that advice and do better. And I immediately like did this write-up and posted the write-up in the show notes for that video and like linked to it immediately and like put it in all caps so that when you see the description, it immediately says like, you know, additional information, please read. And most of the conversation about the video series since I made that write-up has referenced it, which is reassuring to me. But yeah, it was not the best advice. But I think the nugget behind it is still valid, that it's important to challenge the rhetoric.
I would agree with that, absolutely. Not only are we recording this on World Mental Health Day, we're also recording it the day after the second presidential debate in the United States.
Oh, God.
In part 4 of your Why So Angry video, when you were talking about racism, you said, "That is how thoroughly Jack embraced the philosophy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There was seemingly no philosophy horrible enough that he wouldn't align with it if it suited his purposes." End quote. And I seem to see a lot of that nowadays, where people who are voting for either of the 2 major candidates in this election are doing so because they hate the other candidate so much. So it seems like this philosophy that you expressed in your video doesn't apply just to Gamergate, and it's not just a year and a half ago that we're seeing it.
No. And I mean, we should say that there are times when embracing the philosophy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is the reasonable response in certain instances, right? Because there are times when you need to make an alliance in order to oust, like, I don't know, a tyrannical dictator. But it is always risky because a lot of the time you turn a blind eye to the flaws with the person that you are allying with. And you can see that a lot in Trumpism. It is actually interesting, though, because we are also seeing the Republican Party has finally decided what is the line that the enemy of my enemy cannot cross. Because, you know, the RNC just decided it's officially no longer supporting Donald Trump, and all these Republican senators and congresspeople are withdrawing their endorsements of him. And that's kind of a big deal. And it is sort of nice knowing, even if that line is placed in a very, very bad position, there was a line that they wouldn't cross. And that is one of the things about Gamergate is I don't think there was a line in Gamergate. There was really nothing Gamergate could ever do that would alienate the people who had allied themselves with it. And it is nice to see that even if it shouldn't have taken nearly this long, there is a line among a lot of Trump supporters.
Sometimes I felt like what we were seeing in this presidential campaign was almost as if Gamergate had its own political party. But it sounds like Gamergate is... It sounds like it hasn't gotten that bad, is what you're saying. Gamergate is even worse than anything we've seen.
Well, I mean, Gamergate is smaller than what we're seeing, I would say. Gamergate adores Donald Trump. Or not Gamergate, but like the environment, the Chan environment that spawned Gamergate also spawned a lot of Trumpism. And yeah, they adore him. And they are operating in very much the same way as Gamergate did. Like, there are people who are devoted to Trump, and there is nothing he can do that will ever alienate him from them. But it seems that the reach of that is limited. Like, if you are going to mobilize a really, really toxic base, you're going to have to accept that however toxic that base is and however much damage it is able to do, it will never grow beyond a certain size. And that size is not always enough to support whatever it is you're trying to accomplish.
So Gamergate is able to make life absolutely miserable for a handful of important people in the games industry, but they're not necessarily going to get their fingers on the nuclear codes.
Gamergate won't, no. But, I mean, they do damage in other, like, subtler ways, right? Like, are you familiar with the concept of the Overton window?
Actually, I'm not.
So the Overton window is what they call like the range of discussion that is considered allowable in politics, but also broadly speaking in public discourse, right? And like for the longest time, socialism was something that you simply could not talk about in politics. If you said anything positive about socialism, that was just too far outside the norm. And now that Bernie Sanders has run a fairly successful, if ultimately, not the winning campaign, but a fairly successful one, it seems to have expanded the Overton window enough that maybe now it's okay to talk to some degree about socialism without immediately being ousted as yourself being like a dirty commie. One of the negative effects of Gamergate and of Trumpism is that it moves the Overton window in the other direction. That, okay, we found the line at which people will not follow, but so many other things Trump has said have been deemed acceptable to say now. Like, it is okay to say, yeah, maybe Japanese internment camps in America weren't such a bad thing, and maybe we need to entertain that possibility in the future. And it's okay to say, yeah, maybe we'll bar an entire religion from ever entering the country for a few years. And those are things that should have been political suicide. But because he had this base behind him, even if he's not going to win the election, he has changed the conversation in a very detrimental way. And that's really the thing that concerns me, is the way that these people change the discourse and make it more mainstream acceptable to be this kind of really, really vile human. You've seen the limit of like, okay, I can't be this vile. Like, I can't talk about sexually assaulting white women. That's the line you can't cross. But also now all these people know what things are short of that line. And that's really distressing.
And that Overton window isn't going to snap back to some default after November 8th.
No. And I mean, we've seen the rate of like hate crimes against minorities has spiked dramatically since Donald Trump got the nomination. And that violence is not simply going to go away if he loses the election. So it takes a lot of hard work to move the Overton window back to where you want it. And sometimes it only takes one just whack job to drag it away from where you want it.
One of the things Clinton said in last night's debates was that bullying is up. And I don't have any statistics to back that up, but I have read anecdotes where bullying is taking the form of things that Trump has said, where children of certain ethnicities or religions in grade schools are being bullied because of those attributes, using words that Trump has said, coming out of the mouths of other kids.
I believe it. It's often learned behavior.
Right. I thought that opening question was a very good one, even if the answers weren't that great, where somebody asked, are you modeling appropriate behavior? And it wasn't until an hour and a half later where Clinton said, our children are watching and are learning from us. So for those who you are able to reach and who are open to engaging with these ideas, you have a great bibliography in your videos. You specifically mentioned in your videos several times the book Backlash by Susan Faludi. Are there any specific resources that you would recommend somebody go to learn more about what your videos were about?
I feel like so many of the common resources have been like the background radiation of my life for so long, it's hard to remember where I got a lot of it. I can recommend individual people who have written a lot of great stuff about it. Like Catherine Cross and Lee Alexander wrote some absolutely fabulous writing during the time of Gamergate, if you want to read more about that specifically. And they've written a lot of fabulous writing about feminism as it relates to gaming in general. Anita's, both her Tropes versus Women in Video Games and her original Tropes versus Women series that was about movies and television is like, I don't know, one of the reasons why so many feminists and feminist allies, like everyone says like, oh, well, all the criticism of Anita Sarkeesian gets lumped in with harassment. No one will ever like criticize her for the things that are actually wrong with her. And it's like, well, that's because anyone who knows anything about feminism has known most of what she's saying for a very long time. Like, it's very much Feminism 101, and it's very well constructed Feminism 101, which makes it a really great entry point. Like, if you want to think about basically how third wave feminism has put a certain amount of focus on how are women represented in popular media, I actually think Sarkeesian, if, they didn't do so much work making her on the wrong end of the Overton window, would actually be a really great resource for people to just go in with eyes unclouded and just learn the basics. Faludi's book is pretty specifically about like this 80s backlash. It's a fabulous resource in general, but I don't know if it's the best like entry level text, you know?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I will include a lot of links in the show notes to your own bibliography. Obviously, this podcast was inspired by Feminist Frequency. We probably wouldn't be chatting here right now if Anita Sarkeesian hadn't gone on Kickstarter and had the experience that she had, unfortunately. Those resources are definitely good entry points and good Feminism 101. So like I said, there'll be links to those in the show notes, and we've talked a lot for the last hour about the content of Why Are We So Angry. If you have a few more minutes, I'd like to talk to you a bit about your approach to creating these videos and your own video style. Do you have a moment?
Mm-hmm.
Swell. So we talked about like how you go into researching the videos, but I want to know how you arrived at the presentation style. For example, Anita Sarkeesian appears on screen, on camera, and she cuts in frames and video footage of the subject she's talking about. But with the exception of your videos about crowdfunding, your videos about games, you are nowhere to be seen in live video. A photo here and there, but you yourself are only heard and not seen. Why that approach?
Originally, that's actually kind of how I figured I would get started. On the one hand, that makes editing so much easier because you don't have to find an image for everything. It's like the image is always my face. And that's great. Part of it is that I want people, like, I don't want to be the subject most of the time. Like, I do a certain affordance to the fact that it is impossible to share your opinion without to some degree being the subject of the article, the essay, the video, whatever. And so I try to acknowledge, like, yes, I am not objective. I am a human being. I have opinions. I am sharing my opinions. I have to acknowledge the man behind the curtain. But for the most part, I still want the thing that I am talking about to be the subject. There was also just the logistical issue of I don't have a nice camera. And I tried to actually record a video using my webcam. But if you record for more than like 10 minutes, at least on my computer, you start to go out of sync with the audio. And trying to sync the audio back up was a nightmare. Being a person who has studied film and video, I know what good video looks like. And it is easier for me to make good looking video that doesn't have like footage of my face in it than it is for me to get decent looking footage of my face on a budget. Because if I want it to be decent looking, I probably need a lighting kit. I probably need a better background than my bedroom because my bedroom is not really fit for television. And yeah, when I did those crowdfunding videos, it took 3 tries. Like I recorded those videos all the way through 3 times before I actually got one I could edit with. Because first, like the camera, it turns out the camera I checked out from school by default records to a format that you can't edit in Final Cut with. So I had to record it again. And then it turned out that, I had recorded it, but the focus reset between takes and I didn't know it. And so I was out of focus for the entire second one. So then I recorded it again. And then I had to do all this like color correction because the light was changing because I was using natural light and all of this stuff. And it becomes such a hassle that I'm just like, I never want to appear on camera ever again. And in general, like, I don't want to be a celebrity, right? Like, I don't want the focus to ever be on me because, I don't know, if you saw my video about internet fame, I'm pretty ambivalent about the idea of ever being a star of any sort on the internet. And I feel like if you sort of stay off camera, it's harder for people to get invested in you as a person.
At the same time, though, you could go to the opposite extreme and you could deliver your message via audio only with a podcast. Why not do that?
I guess just because video is my favorite medium, and I think it's hard to talk about games in a purely audio form because games are a visual and auditory and, kinesthetic experience. And if you show games in video, you're at least getting 2 out of 3. And video is just the medium that I love. Like it's how I most enjoy expressing myself. Video is one of the most delightful things to work with, and it's what makes me the happiest to work on. And I think working with what makes me happy makes my content better.
That makes perfect sense. You are your primary audience in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned in the Patreon video that your videos, they range over a number of topics. You do games, you do adventure games, Sonic, but also Phil Fish, GamerGate, etc. And so you have a lot of different audiences, in a way almost like Sonic himself does. But There's definitely a connective tissue that coheres all your videos. These are thoughtful analyses of different phenomena in gaming culture. Have you ever considered doing something less academic that would be easier to spin out and it wouldn't take a month? For example, I have a YouTube channel as well, and I can sit down for an hour, play a game, record it, chop it up into 6 10-minute videos, and release one video a day for a week. None of them will get as many views as yours do, but they are a hell of a lot easier to produce.
Yeah, that's not really my thing. Like, let's play. I don't know. I am a lot more interesting after weeks or months of thinking about a subject than I am off the cuff. Maybe your listeners will feel that about exactly this podcast. But yeah, I don't know. I like to sit on an idea for a long time. I'm not very good in an argument because someone will say something to me that I don't agree with, but I can't put my finger on why I disagree with it for like 3 days later. A lot of the work that I do is just mulled over for so long. Like the Phil Fish video, I had been thinking about that subject matter for like a year and a half by the time I actually put the video together. And I think that's why it's as cogent as it is, you know? So I don't know. Like, yeah, I could do Let's Plays. I could also talk about like movies and politics and things like that. And that's maybe a direction I'm going to drift into with time. I don't necessarily want to be a guy who only talks about games and gaming culture. It is just sort of an area where I feel like I have a lot of sure footing.
No, that makes perfect sense. Just like you're focusing on video instead of audio because it's what you love, you're also focusing on the content that matters to you and which you're confident in. And that's why I also believe that your videos, although, as I mentioned, they are much more difficult to produce than anything I do, they're also much better and much more important than any videos that I do.
Oh, I'm flattered.
Well, if you were to chop off, like I have over 600 videos on my channel compared to, you have, what, 14? Thereabouts?
Maybe? I don't know.
So yeah, I have over 600 videos, and if you were to delete the 3 most popular videos, you would crush me in views. I am very much a 3-trick pony or whatever.
I'm kind of a 3-trick pony as well. If you deleted my 3 most popular projects, like This is Phil Fish, Why Are You So Angry? In my video about Super Smash Brothers, if you deleted those 3, you would have taken out like 92% of my channel traffic.
But all your videos consistently get tens of thousands of views. Most of my videos have tens of views. So yeah, but again, you really can't compare a Let's Play to what you're doing because they are so significantly different.
Yeah.
What about the actual tools that you use? I understand that you do rely on some of the equipment available to you through your education.
Yeah, I use the sound studio on campus to record the audio, and then occasionally, like the times that I've needed a camera, I've been able to check one out from school.
What are you going to do when you graduate, if that ever happens?
That's a very, very scary question. Thank you for asking it. I don't know what I'm going to do for recording because I do not have a very soundproof living space. And I guess I know someone who has a little sound recording studio in his home who might let me use it. But that's adding even more steps to getting the audio recorded. Like right now, recording audio is one of the slowest parts of producing the videos because, you know, once the script is done, it's not like, oh, I can just record it and then start working and then re-record it as necessary. I have to go to a place and reserve time and be there at a specific time, get everything recorded and bring it home. And if I need to change anything, I've got to go through that whole rigmarole again. I would love to do what Tony Joe does from Every Frame of Painting and just record the first draft of the script and then just edit it on the fly by re-recording segments as I need to. But there's so many steps involved that I can't do that. So I would love to just have a good mic here in my home and record here. But like, I don't even have a proper door separating me from the rest of the house. It's like a little sliding door that doesn't latch. And in the summer, it's really warm. And so closing the windows is a nightmare. And I'm right next to a road where like at the same time every night, like 15 motorcycles drive by. So I don't know. I really don't know what happens sound-wise in the spring when I graduate. Maybe I'm going to have to find a space in the house that I can soundproof. We have a little office. maybe I could soundproof that, but it's also got like the water heater in it. So that's going to click on randomly. I don't know. I don't know what happens.
That is not ideal.
I really don't know what happens 9 months from now to the channel, and it's kind of scary.
You'll just have to get that many more Patreon backers.
I guess, yeah. I'll have to get enough Patreon backers that I can rent a sound studio.
Have you found Patreon to be helpful?
Patreon is a godsend. Patreon is amazing.
How so?
Kickstarter was awesome because it gave me this big lump of money, and it meant that I could work full time on my channel for, I guess it was supposed to be 6 months. I ended up stretching the money to 9 months, which I think was pretty cool. But Kickstarter runs out, and there are a few people who can actually just run a Kickstarter every year to support another year of the thing they do, right? Like Erica Moen, who does webcomics, every year she runs a Kickstarter to do the last year of webcomics collected in a book. And she does that every year. But I don't know if the internet is going to be cool with people running Kickstarters annually, right? Like they should be, but I don't know if they are, because we still have this like reflexive mentality that, well, once you've had a successful Kickstarter, you are quote unquote a success, and now you shouldn't need it. And I think people start to turn against you if they think you are successful and yet you still go asking for money. And Patreon being a service that just lets people subscribe to me, and I just sort of get a lump sum of money every month, and that amount gets a little bit bigger every month, even though I'm not necessarily working harder. Like I'm still not making a very good hourly wage. If you actually crunch the numbers of like how many hours of work I put into these videos versus how much I actually get for them. But being able to see that, well, every month my hourly wage is a bit closer to minimum wage, that's really gratifying. And it means that I can keep doing this indefinitely. And the idea of knowing that I have an indefinite career as opposed to, well, I've got however many Kickstarters people will let me get away with, and then who knows? Yeah, no, Patreon is amazing.
Do you get paid through Patreon every month whether or not you put out a video?
I do. When the channel started, I didn't. It was per video. But then I sort of ended up on this treadmill of like, well, I cannot yet afford to make a video every month because I don't get enough per month. I can't devote the number of hours to videos that I would like to. I have to freelance. But then when I freelance, that takes time away from making the videos. And you end up in this like catch-22 of the longer I go without making a video, the less money I have. But the only way to get the videos up to the level I need them to be is to put one out every month. And that's what I can't afford to do until it's already up to a certain level. And it's a nightmare. So I sent a message out to the patrons saying like, hey, most people who do what I do, they actually charge monthly, not per video. I'm going to switch it to that. If anyone's not comfortable with that, if you feel that, I've set this milestone where I said like, I can guarantee a video a month if I get to this amount, and we're not there yet. And so right now it's just, I can put out a video most months, but I can't guarantee a video every month. And if anybody's not comfortable with that, you don't have to subscribe, and, I won't bear a grudge with anybody. But that's kind of the way it's got to be right now. Like if I made it paid per video, I would have to release even fewer, and I would have to freelance even more.
Because that's what Patreon is doing. It's not necessarily covering your expenses. It's paying for your time, which you could spend elsewhere making other money.
Yeah, it's the opportunity cost.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and that's the thing about freelancing is, when you're a freelancer, you have to charge rates that not only cover the cost of labor, but also cover the time between this gig and however long it takes you to find the next gig.
Sounds exhausting.
It is.
I do not envy you, sir. All right, so we have covered a lot of ground, and we've covered a lot of time as well. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
I remember you wanted to ask about Final Cut, right?
I was going to let you get away with that. You use Final Cut Pro 7. I use Final Cut Pro X. So we're both Mac users, but you are using the older generation, and I'm using Final Cut Pro X because that is the first version of Final Cut I ever tried.
Huh.
So I wasn't transitioning from a different version. I assume that you tried Final Cut Pro X and didn't like it?
No, I started out on Final Cut, Final Cut 3, maybe. I started getting trained back on my first go through college, where Final Cut was just what they were training us on. And that's what I got trained on. All the computers at school when I was doing it were Macs, and you needed to have a Mac at home if you wanted to work at home, because you needed a portable hard drive that was Mac formatted in order to bring work from school to home. And I've never really been able to afford a second desktop. So it's like, if I ever switched to PC, I would just be flushing everything I've ever done down the toilet. Like, I'd never be able to touch any of my projects ever again. So I've always kind of been devoted to Final Cut because that's what I've known. I did not follow in the transition to X because, no disrespect to you, but I think X is kind of terrible. They completely rewrote the system from the ground up, and it means that none of my projects, again, same problem, none of my projects would transfer over to Final Cut X. And I know at this point the industry is pretty much exclusively using Premiere Pro. And I'm probably going to make the switch to Premiere sometime in the next few months, because being on Final Cut is actually starting to lose me clients at this point. But I've been holding out for a long time because I know the switch is probably going to slow me down for a while as I learn new tech. And I really, really don't want to be working even slower than I already am.
I didn't realize the industry was standardizing on Adobe. I've tried Premiere Pro, and I wasn't a huge fan.
Yeah, I have no idea what it feels like. I know that they've put a lot of effort into making it easy to transition to from Final Cut. Like, there's a setting that lets all the Final Cut hotkeys work in Premiere, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I think it was a case of when they switched from Final Cut 7 to Final Cut X and they, completely redesigned it. Premiere is part of the Adobe Creative Cloud, which means anyone who has Photoshop already has Premiere if they want it. And that was maybe kind of a deliberate, like, another Trojan horse of sneaking this program on. It's like, oh, hey, the program that's been industry standard for a long time just changed dramatically. Well, there's a program already on your computer that you can set up to run a lot like the old version of that, and we're going to keep updating it. So I don't know, that was crafty of them.
It's not something they could have done without Apple's contribution to screwing up the series, though.
Yeah.
Oh, well, for those of us who just don't know any better, and I don't take it as any offense, I was coming from iMovie, and so the transition to Final Cut Pro was much more natural than the transition to Adobe Premiere.
Yeah, I've heard Final Cut X is basically iMovie Pro.
That's what I've heard, and I believe it. But for us amateurs, well, I guess you're a professional. You get paid for this. I'm an amateur. For me, it suits my purposes.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense for doing Let's Plays, right?
Those two. I do unboxing videos and a couple of other things, but primarily my needs are simple. You talked a lot more about your video production methodology in Critical Distance, the podcast, episode number 39, which just came out last Wednesday. A huge shout out to them for hosting you and for having a great interview with you. I've tried not to cover the same ground, so there will be a link in the show notes to people who want to know more about what goes on behind the scenes at Innuendo Studios. Just visit critical-distance.com for another excellent gaming podcast. Ian, thank you so much for your time. This has been so insightful. Remind us where we can find you online.
You can find me online at Twitter. I'm Innuendo Studios on Twitter, all one word, capital I, capital S. I'm basically the same on most other social media, on Tumblr. My YouTube, you can find by searching Innuendo Studios, but the channel name is technically Mr. Skimps, MrSkimps. It will probably change to Innuendo Studios soon, but for now, that's the link. And then I'm also on Patreon as Innuendo Studios.
I didn't know YouTube channels could change.
Yeah, you can claim. I think this might be one of these things that they just roll out randomly. They're like, oh, we like you. Here's a feature that we don't give to everybody. But you can push a thing to say, like, yes, I want to claim this as my handle. And I will probably do that soon, but I haven't done it yet.
Well, hopefully you will before this podcast airs and somebody else claims it for you.
Ow, that's smart. Okay, youtube.com/Innuendo Studios.
Yay. Are we going to get to find out where the name Mr. Skimps comes from?
There's not actually a story behind that. There's just young guy finds words funny and chooses them.
Works for me.
Yeah.
Ian Danskin of Innuendo Studios, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ken Gagney of Polygamer.
This has been Polygamer, a Gamebits production. Find more episodes, read our blog, or send feedback at polygamer.net.